welcome to the first ever Climate of Fear podcast. Hello, I'm Harry Wilkinson, Head of Policy at Net Zero Watch, which campaigns for greater scrutiny of climate and energy policies. We decided to launch this podcast because the climate debate has become increasingly shrill, and many thoughtful people are nevertheless scared to raise legitimate concerns about net zero policies, which have become a key plank of Western governments' policy making. That climate of fear has meant we've rushed headlong into some very ambitious, you may say foolhardy policies that aren't being scrutinised nearly enough. We believe that needs to change. We think it needs to start happening. And we believe that the majority of the public believe that as well. Our aim is to empower people to bring that conversation into the mainstream. Now, my first guest is an ideal person to talk about that with. Ross Clark is an award-winning freelance journalist who has written about climate and energy for some time in The Spectator, The Telegraph, The Times, and elsewhere for some time. He's written about climate change in two previous books, The Great Before and The Denial, but today I'm going to be talking to him about his new book, Not Zero, which comes out today and looks at how an irrational target may impoverish you, help China, and won't even save the planet. Ross, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is how did you come to this issue of climate change, which so many people have sort of shy away from. They realise it's just too controversial an area to get into. How did your opinions on this subject evolve, and how have you navigated this censorious atmosphere that sometimes exists?
Well, I've been interested in weather and climate since I was 10 years old. A teacher at primary school decided me and another boy needed some extension work. So he went out and ordered some meteorological equipment, thermometers and so on for us. And fortuitously, this was about 10 days before the 1976 heat wave, when suddenly everybody was talking about the weather. And I just got very interested. By the time I was 12, I had my own weather station at the bottom of the garden. And that was just before another very cold winter, 1979, when suddenly the story was, are we heading for a new ice age? So I have memories of it going right back to those days when the big story was, are we heading for another ice age? So when a decade later, suddenly the story switched to global warming, I had a sort of natural healthy skepticism. And, you're not going to persuade me of anything till you present me with the real world data, not a bit of modelling that's just reflecting the prejudices you're putting into it, but real world data. And that has obviously evolved over the years, and it's pretty clear that since around 1980 the globe has been on a warming trend in temperatures. That is very likely connected with human carbon emissions, but we can't actually prove that, but it is very likely. I accept that's not, I don't have a problem with that. But it's just become more and more hysterical over the years, and it's got to the stage where I was at a public lecture a few weeks ago with John Kerry, the US climate envoy, and he announced to this huge audience, made up as it were out of interest with quite a few climate scientists, said 10 million people around the world are dying from the heat because of choices we make with our economy and so on. And I wasn't quite sure what he was referring to at the time. I went home and looked it up and found the paper that I'm pretty sure he was referring to, University of Monash study in Australia. And what did it say? It said 5 million people were being killed a year by extreme temperatures, 9/10 of them by extreme cold. And that was true even in Africa. It was true on every continent in the world, that more people were actually being killed by the cold than the heat. And not only that, while there's a slight upward trend in the number of people being killed by the heat, there's an even bigger downward trend in the number of people being killed by the cold as the Earth warms up. So in reality, the numbers of people dying of extreme heat is reducing. You say climate change, global warming is actually saving lives, and yet, here is a respected person, US climate envoy, telling this sort of great fib that 10 million people are being bumped off by the heat every year. It's extraordinary how that kind of hysteria has been allowed to creep into the debate.
There's that huge asymmetry, isn't there, between the claims of skeptics, which are gone through with a fine-tooth comb, and any little mistake will be picked up. And yet you see these extreme claims about how dangerous climate change is going to be from very senior people in all walks of life, which really aren't sort of questioned, when even very glaring mistakes are made, they often pass without any real correction. And I remember Boris Johnson at COP26 saying how all types of extreme weather were getting worse, and how we just had a few minutes to midnight left on the clock. And those alarmist kind of statements just aren't picked up. But there is a wealth of facts and figures in your new book. I think one of the great things about it is it examines those claims from a factual perspective, a lot of the time not necessarily getting into the politics, but just looking at the practical ways that net zero might be achieved and how challenging that is in a whole range of areas. So with this book, did you find it hard to find a publisher for it? And in terms of your journalism, do you find editors are open-minded to bringing up the topic of net zero in the way that you do, or has that become more difficult?
I find newspaper editors are quite open to discussing this subject properly, and from both sides of all directions, really, all sides of it. Publishing is a lot harder nut to crack. There's a lot of young people go into publishing idealistic minded. They think they can sort of just shut down anything they don't like. It wasn't easy to find a publisher. The usual thing, I send it off to agents. Didn't hear a single thing apart from one who said, oh, I don't agree with you and not publishing, not going to do this, you could be better off with someone else, and so on. The rest didn't even bother replying. But I did then find forum press who were making a point of publishing books which other publishers are perhaps not so keen on publishing, and they were laudably they gave me a hearing. They read the book and decided that this was a book that deserved to be heard, and I was away. So fortunately, the publishing industry is still large enough that there are those there are people who will take you seriously, even if there's a sort of mainstream which sort of tries to block off such ideas.
That's right, and those voices and those platforms which still allow that more open discussion have become all the more important in today's climate. So as I said before, your book goes through different areas such as heating, for example, transport, the use of electric vehicles, how we make aviation and shipping net zero, and how we get emissions in those areas down to as close to zero as is possible. And you bring up some very good reasons why those things are going to be difficult. But are you perhaps a bit guilty of being too pessimistic? The government would say we've reduced emissions by almost 50% already since 1990, and shouldn't that give us plenty of optimism for the future, that we can continue to have new businesses that are bringing forward ideas and will help us get emissions down? What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say firstly that the sort of 50% reduction the government keeps claiming, that's a sort of bit of a bogus figure, really. And to give her a credit, Greta Thunberg has pointed this out as well, that it only refers to territorial emissions, that is, carbon emissions physically spewed out within Britain. It doesn't include aviation, it doesn't include shipping, and even more crucially, it doesn't include carbon emissions spewed out elsewhere in the world in the name of creating consumer goods, food and so on for UK consumers. And if you calculate carbon emissions on a consumption basis, that is the emissions worldwide that are serving UK consumers, emissions are down, but they're down about 26%, not 50%. But there's a huge danger in this target, because the target is a territorial emissions target. And what that means is the government has just given itself a huge incentive to close down industries and food production in Britain and transfer it abroad. Let foreign countries make our goods, grow our food for us, because then the emissions go on some other country's carbon budget, and it makes it easier for the government, UK government, to claim that it's reduced emissions. And I mean, it's complete madness that we've created. And it is what is happening. And you think in terms of rewilding versus agriculture, the government wants to rewild land, says never mind the agricultural land, production will go overseas, we'll be importing food, the carbon emissions are exported. Same with steel making, cement making. These are very, very difficult industries to decarbonise, because it's not just the energy. With steel and cement making, it's what are called process emissions, where the chemical process of making the goods itself releases large amounts of carbon dioxide. So steel and cement between them are sort of 12-15% of global emissions, a really big slice. And then fertilizer making as well, and agriculture, as we know. And there are some things where we will make progress, and we already have made progress, haven't we? We've virtually eliminated coal burning for thermal coal for power stations, replaced it with a mixture of gas and wind. I mean, that has more than halved the emissions from the electricity sector. That's a good thing.
You feel that fossil fuels often don't get enough credit for the emissions reductions that they're actually responsible for, because the changes in the way we use fossil fuels and which fossil fuels that we use have actually been a massive cause behind falling emissions in Western countries.
Yeah, so you burn gas, basically you're releasing around half as much of carbon as you are if you burn coal, and that's just the chemical makeup of it. And we've replaced a lot of coal burning with gas. I mean, in America the same has happened. Coal has gone out the window, it was declined. Gas burning has taken its place, thanks to shale extraction largely. And I mean, this is the fascinating thing, is that even during the big bad Trump's time in office, US carbon emissions were falling sharply because of shale gas. And whereas you look in Germany, which is one of the goodies of the global carbon community, has committed itself theoretically to net zero by 2045, 5 years before Britain, and yet they're turning back to coal because they made such a mess of their energy policy, relying too much on Putin's gas, that they're now going back to burning not just coal but lignite, just about the most foulest form of coal.
Yeah, Germany is a particular example where climate policy and the best of intentions, or at least firm intentions to reduce emissions, have actually sort of led to or at least they haven't been followed through, because equally strongly held views about nuclear and the need to move away from that has meant that they're more reliant on lignite, as you say.
Yeah, for years, Europe, Britain and the rest of Europe have been following an energy policy which is basically obsessed with the net zero target, and has put energy security on the back burner. And the result of that has been counterproductive, because with this, since the Ukraine invasion, we've sort of had to do without Russian gas. We're going back to coal and so on. And Germany, as you say, where they closed down their nuclear power station, 3 of their nuclear power stations, when Putin's tanks were even on Ukraine's border. I mean, how foolish and short-sighted could you get? And Britain also closed a couple of power stations last year, don't forget.
Yeah, there is this myopia that means that we don't end up looking at issues in a wider sense and consider some of the trade-offs that are involved with certain decisions. One area which you cover, which I think demonstrates that, is in housing, and how targets to reduce emissions coming from housing have led to homes which are actually overheated in some cases, that lead to problems with damp and mould. What have you seen in sort of in terms of decarbonising housing that leaves you concerned about how that target to decarbonise housing will be achieved?
Well, I mean, the government has sort of two prongs on this, if you like. First, it wants to insulate our homes better, perfectly reasonable, you know. We all be better off with proper insulated homes. And it also wants to decarbonise the heating itself, so it wants to ban new gas boilers by 2035, make them sort of hydrogen ready by 2025 possibly. But you know, there are problems with both these approaches, just going at them full on and setting targets. Firstly, on the insulation front, if you just insulate a building, you're going to be in trouble, because you get what's called solar gain, the heat sources within buildings, cooking, and human body light, other appliances. The heat will build up and won't be able to escape, and people overheat. Now, buildings that shouldn't happen. If you've got a properly constructed building, you not just have proper insulation, but you have proper ventilation as well. And you go to Scandinavia and you look at some of the houses built there, fantastically well insulated, but they've also got proper mechanical ventilation system which is changing the air every few minutes. Very healthy environment, very warm environment. But in Britain we have this sort of idea, we're trying to do quick fixes all the time. If you're building a new house, it obviously makes sense to do that, but if you're dealing with an old housing stock, and there's 9 million homes in Britain have solid walls, they can't simply be injected with cavity wall insulation. You're just trying to do a quick fix with those, you're going to create a lot of problems, and damp, as you say, is another one, because you put a lot of insulation on the inside of a building which was built without a damp course. You know, previously the walls would have dried out, they'd have breathed, as we say. Any moisture being sucked out the soil would evaporate. If you cover it with insulation, that can't happen, and then you're trapping damp. And you know, we've already had all kinds of bad stories from when government insulation schemes, where you just get a bunch of cowboys, frankly, coming in, taking up the subsidies and doing a quick hash job. It makes absolute sense to demand very good standards of new buildings, but for the old buildings it's a different matter. As regards the heating systems themselves, replacing gas boilers with heat pumps, as the government wants to do. Heat pump works very effectively in a well insulated building. They don't work so well in old buildings which aren't so well insulated, draftier. And they're fantastically expensive. I have a friend who's just spent £10,000 installing a heat pump, and his house isn't that big. And the guy who fitted it, well, this will sort out about 90% of your heating needs. Well, if you're going to spend £10,000 on a heating system, that's 5 times as much as a new boiler would cost. You'd at least expect it to do all your heating for you. And we're producing heating systems which aren't going to do that, and that's a huge cost to load on the poor, and especially it's not going to even work properly at the end of it. You have people shivering as well as emptying their pockets.
I think a lot of the time, even though most people and ministers included in that will accept that there are significant challenges to reaching net zero, the fact that it's now in legislation means that people treat the topic as if net zero is being decided and it's all about how we get there as quickly, as cheaply, and as successfully as possible. Do you think there's a risk here in not really dealing with the topic of net zero first, because as you will know, there was only 90 minutes of debate when that target was updated in the House of Commons from that original target of 80% reduction that was in the Climate Change Act to a new target of 100% reduction. Do we need to relook again at the objective of net zero, or is that something that you're supportive of in principle?
I think we're going to have to look at it. The closer we get to that target, the more painful it's going to become, the more expensive it's going to become. And as you say, there are only 90 minutes of debate in the House of Commons in a week when the country was obsessed with Brexit. By the way, there's the dying days of Theresa May's government. There was no vote in the House of Commons. One MP sort of raised the question, well, why haven't you done an impact statement, which is, something the government produces when it wants to sort of, fines for dog poo or something. But come to the most far-reaching law passed in Britain in modern times, and it said, oh no, we don't need an impact statement, don't need an impact assessment. And then went to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords did have a vote, and they did pass an amendment. They said, well, can the government please tell us how it's going to get to net zero? They still voted for it, and the government still hasn't told us how it's going to get to net zero. On the day that this was nodded through Parliament, all the MPs had was this sort of dubious estimate by the Climate Change Committee, which advises the government on this, saying it would cost £1 trillion between now and 2050, and that didn't sound too bad to a lot of MPs. We'll nod it through. Then the National Grid tried to come up with an estimate just for decarbonising the grid, and they came up with 3 trillion. The government Treasury then, kept being pressed to come up with an estimate for reaching net zero, so they couldn't do it. We don't know how we're going to do it. Well, how can you estimate the cost of something when you know you're not going to do it? And we just keep having these plans pumped out by government and its agencies. Was Chris Skidmore the other week, supposedly an independent analysis of net zero, even though he was the minister who pushed it through the Commons in the first place. And we've had another thing from the Climate Change Committee, and they're still not addressing the really crunch issues, like what do you do to keep the lights on with intermittent source of energy like wind and solar? Fundamental problem. We don't know what we're going to do. At the moment we're just turning the gas up and down to make up for lack of wind and sun, but by 2035 government says we're going to get all fossil fuels out of electricity production. What happens then? Nobody has told me.
It also doesn't seem to be contained in any way, in that once you have that legally binding objective, if a particular climate policy is too expensive, it's going to do more harm than any benefits it will have. There is no apparent mechanism to say, actually, well, we tried to achieve the target in this area, but it was too expensive, and so we waited until something better came along. But you can't do that, can you, with net zero?
No, you absolutely can't. When you set yourself a legally binding target, then you've got to do it. And what's going to happen if the government doesn't sort of get towards this target, and it's already sort of missing it, isn't it, on its sort of stages? It'll be sued over and over again by all these environmentalists, and they've really started doing it.
With every year that passes, these targets look less and less realistic, and legal cases are surely, as you say, going to become much more frequent. We've seen already, I believe it was in the High Court, Client Earth launched a case in which they said the government doesn't lay out its net zero plans in enough detail, and the court's decision was that the government hadn't laid out enough detail. Should the government be laying out more detail? What's your view about that?
And the result of that case, the government's, I would say, produced a couple more reports and is still not laying out any detail, which is madness. And you look, I mean, when this was passed in 2019, the big idea was Britain was going to be the first country, then all other countries around the world were going to follow suit, and they were going to copy us, be inspired by us. And you know, you look around the world now, the few other, mostly European countries have set themselves a legally binding target, and those countries which have account for about 1/10 of global carbon emissions. But the really big emitters, China, 1/3 of global emissions, US, you know, another 1/6 of global emissions, something around there, they've shown no interest in setting a legally binding target. China has set an aspiration to do it by 2060. All Joe Biden's done, he's produced a target for cutting emissions by 50% by 2030s, but the only other thing he's done is this great Inflation Reduction Act. It's really just a bit of protectionism in disguise. It's offering huge incentives to motorists who buy US-made electric cars, who, you know, homeowners who fit US-made heating systems and so on. It's just a blatant bung for US industry to try and cut off foreign industry, and it's already beginning to happen. There's a van making company that makes electric vans in Bedfordshire. They're going to the States because they said, well, you know, energy is very expensive here, that doesn't help us, but, you know, we go to America, we're going to get a big handout from the government. So, you know, governments have said, oh, we'll go net zero, create all these green jobs. So they're not, they're going to export all the green jobs.
And if there's one industry that we should be world leading in as the main users of offshore wind technology, has that worked out as ministers said it would, in that Britain would become a world leader in this technology and export it to the rest of the world? That was the promise. But what's actually happened?
What's actually happened, we've installed a huge amount of offshore wind turbines, which are quite good things really, as long as you've got backup and so on. I'm not against them, but I mean, they're certainly not made in Britain, or very few parts of them made in Britain. There was a company up in Scotland which was making the towers, which went bust. I understand it's since been bought out, but you know, most of the materials for the offshore wind turbines put up in Britain are made China or other countries, and there's certainly no benefit to the ONS says the green economy, produced a figure for it, has not grown in 10 years. The number of green jobs in Britain has shrunk since 2018. 10
years, no growth in the renewable industry.
All, no.
The big new industry that was supposed to be the growth area, the government's industrial strategy is based off of a green industrial revolution. So you're saying there's no signs of this green industrial revolution coming into action?
Well, there is a green industrial revolution, but most of the jobs are in China. That's the thing. I mean, China's a big maker, big investor in wind energy. Also, you know, a big world's leader in coal-fired power stations. It wants energy, but you know, it's basically stealing all those. You know, that green industry that was supposed to be in Britain has just gone over to China. Why? Because the costs are less there, particularly the energy costs.
China, of course, is a key theme in your book, and I wondered whether you think China is a threat to the West in this regard. Is China being cynical here? Do you believe their promises about climate? Because officially, the Chinese government says it's also committed to net zero. They want to by 2060 have also met the net zero target. Do you believe that? And where should we place China's role in the green future?
Well, the Chinese government has made it absolutely clear in setting that 2060 target that it is not going to stand in the way of economic growth. And it's set itself targets to reduce emissions, but they're expressed in a wholly different way. They're expressed in per unit of GDP, so they're allowing themselves the room to grow.
There is that qualification that we were speaking about a moment ago that allows you to put people's welfare as high as it should be.
Exactly, and obviously China is not a great democracy, and we should be sceptical or whatever it says. But I mean, it's what it's saying on climate change is actually quite consistent. It's saying, climate change is a problem. We'll try and reduce emissions, and we'll set ourselves target. But what we are not going to do is put ourselves in a straitjacket by saying we've got to get to net zero by any particular day. That's what we have. It's what China, America, and a few other of the world's countries are, refusing to do.
So China, in a sense, is a model, really, of how we should approach the climate issue.
I'd say it is. Yeah, set yourself a target, a ambition. Say we'll try to do that. We'll try to, develop technologies which will allow us to get there. But don't say we've got to get there, otherwise, you can sue us. That's the problem.
Moving on now, I think the idea wind is cheap, wind power is cheap, solar power is cheap. These are claims that we hear very often, and they're used to justify why we need to accelerate the green energy transition in response to the recent turmoil that we've seen in energy markets, increasingly high energy prices, many people really struggling to afford their energy bills. Is that true? Is wind as cheap as is being claimed, and can it help us get out of the energy crisis that we're in at the moment?
Yeah, well, there's a claim which has been going round for the past few months, claiming that wind is only 1/9 the 9 times cheaper than gas electricity. It was a completely bogus figure when it was put out last summer. It was a website called Carbon Brief, and what they did was they compared the long-term guaranteed index-linked prices that are offered to the builders of wind and solar farms with what are called the day-ahead prices for gas power, and those are the prices which the wholesale market has to pay to persuade the owner of a gas plant to turn it on for a few hours when low winds are forecast. So it's like trying to compare the cost of a trip on the bus with a season ticket with the cost of hailing a Uber at peak hours on a day of a rail strike. It's just non-comparable things. Obviously the cost of gas has increased quite a little bit over the past year, and the costs of wind have come down over the past decade, or they had come down until 2021, largely as a result of the cost of steel and rare metals used in the turbines and so on, that coming down. That's now turned around, and the wind producer this week was saying that the cost of building a wind turbine has just gone up by 40% in the past year. Now, if the cost of building a turbine has gone up, well, that is the main cost in wind energy. So, slightly down the line, the cost of wind energy is going to go up by about 40% from, its low of last year. Solar panels, the same. They came down quite a lot in price thanks to commodities coming down in price. So the commodities turn around, the cost goes up. But what we really need is a mixture of energy. Obviously, wind is great when the wind's blowing. Solar is great when the sun's shining. But if you're going to have a national grid based on those intermittent renewables, you can't just look at the cost of wind and solar in isolation. You've got to look at the cost of the backup or the storage that you're going to use. And the storage is incredibly expensive compared to the cost of the wind energy. I mean, to put it, this is from the Pacific National Laboratories, cost of generating wind power, approximately $50 per megawatt hour at present. The cost of storing that energy in a lithium ion battery is about $300 per megawatt hour, 6 times as much.
So that's the kind of magnitude that we're talking about. that we need to try and overcome if these technologies are going to work effectively. There needs to be a recognition, I think, of actually the value of different types of energy. We talk about the cost of producing wind electricity or gas-fired electricity. That's one element, but actually there's an enormous amount of value to having a source of energy that you can switch on and off whenever you need it, and that has to be as much of a part of the conversation as just the original cost of producing that electricity. The government's plan, of course, is to build lots more offshore wind, lots more solar power, 40 gigawatts, I believe, of new offshore wind. Looking at these plans, are these plans going to bring energy prices down? What will be the impact of building such a large amount of new renewables?
Well, this is going to exacerbate the problem we already have. We already have enough wind and solar installed capacity theoretically to meet average UK current electricity demand. There's about 37 gigawatts of installed power. The average power usage in Britain is about 38 gigawatts. The trouble is, though, that on a good day we can get more than 50% of our electricity from wind and solar. On a bad day, such as we had in December, that fell below 2%. And that's a huge deficit to make up. And you can't make up that deficit by bunging people a few pounds to switch off their dishwasher for a couple of hours while the wind is light, which seems to be the main strategy the National Grid is pushing at the moment. I mean, you need huge investment in backup energy or huge investment in storage, and that investment is just not being made.
But wouldn't the advocates of those kind of approaches say, in any one area there might be an enormous gap, however we're going to do things like use people's electric vehicles as battery storage, we're going to pay people and businesses to switch off sometimes, we're going to have backup sources of power that can come on at short notice. We'll use a collection of different methods, and that will be enough together.
Well, it always amuses me, and one of the problems with electric cars is their range. You go maybe 200 miles and you have to take it off the road and plug it in for an hour. And the idea that we can use everybody's car battery to get us through a lull in the wind and the sun's not shining, I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, you plug your car in and think it's charging, and then if the energy's being sucked out the other way, then you get to your car in the morning, you find there's no power because it's all been used up the previous evening keeping people's ovens on. So, you cannot make up those sort of deficits in power just by, ingenious little, programs like the National Grid is trying.
So if you were trying to drive up to Scotland from London, for example, what would be the reality of trying to do that in an electric vehicle?
Yeah, well, it's a journey I do several times a year. I love the Highlands, drive up there about 3 or 4 times a year. And I've got an old diesel car at the moment. It does 700 miles straight out between filling it up, and even then you have to take it off the road for a couple of minutes to fill it up. It's great. 65 miles to the gallon. That's an incredibly efficient vehicle compared with, say, 30 years ago. And I looked into it. I thought, what if I had an electric car? And I thought, what's one of the best-selling electric cars in Britain? Nissan Leaf. So I did a bit of research, and I found out its range. It was supposed to be 168 miles. But then Nissan, quite honest, and it has a range calculator on its website. If you fill the car with passengers and luggage and drive it in temperatures of 5 Celsius, that range falls to under 100 miles. Then you can't obviously empty the battery out. When it gets down to 20%, you've got to fill it up again. You do rapid charge, it'll only go to 80%. So, you'll get about 60 miles per charge in that basis. And I worked out, if I was doing my normal journey to Scotland, and it came out that I'd have to stop 7 times to recharge it, spend an hour each time. And that's if the going was good. But on a lot of the, I mean, there's a website, ZapMap or something, you can look it up where all the charging stations are. And in a lot of these cases where I'd have to stop, there's only one charger, and you know, if other people want to use it, or if it's out of order, well, what do you do then? And we saw after Christmas all these Tesla drivers driving home from their family festivities. There were sort of lines, about 20 or 30 vehicles trying to charge up all at once, because
people often behave, of course, in predictable ways. And part of net zero is about saying, well, what people can exploit times of low demand to get cheaper energy or to charge their vehicles. But actually, of course, people come home from work at similar times. They have their tea at similar times. They behave in similar ways. And just expecting people to suddenly disrupt from that and do things at times that they wouldn't normally do things, that is the kind of radical shift that a lot of these policies necessitate and are being sort of implicitly relied upon in those future calculations about how much this is all going to cost. But perhaps if we could go on to one more topic, I think we should have a look at this issue of how net zero is presented in the media. There's a group that you refer to in the book called Covering Climate Now. What are they about? What's going on there?
Well, this is an organisation that's funded by Columbia University and a variety of sort of liberal benefactors. And what it's trying to do basically is to instruct reporters, news reporters, to how they should cover climate. And it's been, it's both among its members, The Guardian, several newspapers, Reuters, a news agency, and so on. But it rather worries me looking through what it's saying. It said, for example, if you're reporting a hurricane, it's this is in its sort of resources for journalists, style guides, and what to say. And so it said, if there's a hurricane, you can say these incidents are becoming more common as a result of climate change. But I mean, if you actually go and read what the IPCC says about it, and what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in America, who studied hurricanes more than anyone else, they say you can't say that. It's premature to say that climate change is causing any increase in hurricanes. In the US landfalling hurricanes, they haven't increased in 2 centuries. The overall number of hurricanes recorded has increased, but that's quite largely because 200 years ago we didn't have the recording equipment, and if a hurricane was stayed at sea, it never got recorded. The actual scientists who work in this field are quite straightforward and say you can't attribute there is no increase in landfalling hurricanes. You can't sort of.
But of course, we are where we are in terms of the public debate, in terms of what people hear, and of course, many of those alarmist views, whether they're scientifically accurate or not, are believed by the general public. Why do you think skeptics are having such a hard time? What are they doing wrong in terms of not helping people to see that maybe the science isn't matching up to some of these extreme claims?
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, it's not just tropical storms, which you can't link to climate change, but again, you can look this up in the IPCC and the State of the Climate report that's published by the Met Office here. Says that storms at our latitude up to 60 degrees north, storms, extreme wind forms are actually on a downward trend. The sort of storm track, if you like, has shifted a little north, so it's missing Britain. And yet, when we had Storm Arwen in November 2021, this was discussed in Parliament. Well, it had to be, because a lot of people were left without power for a couple of weeks, or even more in some cases. Ed Miliband stood up and blamed it on climate change, and then Kwasi Kwarteng, who was then business secretary, he got up and blamed it on climate change, said it's the strongest storm in 60 years. Nobody picked him up on it. It just seemed to creep into public consciousness, the idea that this storm had been caused by climate change, when actually there's a downward trend in storminess in Britain.
Whenever I try and point out some of these nuances of climate change, people will often not want to accept that that's correct, and perhaps there's a credibility problem here, in that people will say, well, this person is just trying to reduce public demands for action on climate change. Their objective is a fundamentally bad one. They're stopping us from taking the action that we need. Therefore, those kind of people who are saying these kind of things shouldn't be believed, shouldn't be listened to. How do we break through that?
Yeah, well, it's so ideas. So we read The Guardian and BBC and so on, and anybody who has the minutest scepticism about a net zero target is sort of treated as they're some kind of conspiracy theorist and so on. And true, there are people who deny anything's happening with the climate or temperature increasing, or blame it on the sunspots or whatever. And I'm not saying the role of sunspots, I don't know, but when I'm looking for my climate information, I'm reading the IPCC report, which is, especially the Bible of climate research made around the world. But I just see this incredible gulf between what the science is actually saying in that report and what gets reported in the press and the BBC and so on. And it's just this huge gulf, and you think, well, where does it come from, the idea that billions of people are going to suddenly be killed by climate change? And I said, I was trying to discuss my book on the BBC. I was going to be on the Today programme. Last minute, no, sorry, we had a change of editorial direction. Like somebody upstairs had sort of ruled it out of order, and yet they've had Extinction Rebellion on there saying that billions of people are going to be killed by climate change. The claim's not even, challenged, and you think
Roger Hannon
this is
on
ridiculous.
Hard Talk, but they didn't ask many hard questions of him, unfortunately. You end the book, nevertheless, with this optimistic note that people will choose economic progress over this kind of hair shirt environmentalist approach that you think is embodied in net zero. What gives you reason to be optimistic in that way?
Well, people around the world are not going to vote to be poorer. They're not going to, the few, lentil eaters in Islington might, enjoy making themselves poorer. And there is a thing called the degrowth movement, which actually advocates a shrinkage in the global economy to save the planet. But that's, that's off for the birds. Most people are not going to do that. Technology will clean up energy. It will clean up anything, nudge it in the right direction. I'm all for that. Let's put money into new technologies, develop them, and I'm a great believer in a sovereign wealth fund. I think the British government should do what Norway did with its oil and put some money directly investments into green energy companies, and if their technologies work, then we're all richer. But I do not have this faith that you just say, set a target for 2050 net zero, and suddenly the market will magically produce all the solutions, because it won't.
Which of course is what the Conservative government has been saying. Ross, thank you so much for coming on the first ever Climate of Fear podcast. Can I finally recommend everyone gets the Not Zero book that Ross is just releasing today. I'm sure it's available on Amazon, Waterstones, and all reputable booksellers. Thank you very much for listening.